I was the black sheep in this circle, and perhaps I couldn't blame anyone for not being taken seriously. As a matter of fact, it was quite understandable. My candidacy was twice rejected after the call. Currently not fit for active service due to insufficient weight. Twice I swallowed and secretly wiped away bitter tears. My God, there at the front nobody asks what your weight is. Our armies have already crossed Poland in an unprecedented victory march. Just a few days ago, France began to feel the paralyzing blows of our weapons. My father was there. At the beginning of the war, he put his military uniform back on. This meant that my mother would now have very little to do around the household when she was allowed to return to our home on the frontier, and I had to celebrate my 18th birthday in Posen on my own for the first time. Only then did I realize how much I owed to my parents, who had given me a happy youth. When will I be able to return home, sit down at the piano, or pick up a cello or violin? Only a few months ago, I wanted to devote myself to the study of music. Then I changed my mind and became interested in mechanical engineering. For the same reason, I volunteered for the army, specializing in anti-tank self-propelled guns. But in the spring of 1940, they didn't need volunteers at all. I was assigned as an infantryman. But that wasn't bad either. The main thing was that I was accepted. After a while, our compartment became quiet. No doubt everyone had something to think about. Thoughts were swarming in their heads. The long hours of our journey certainly gave the most favourable opportunity for this. By the time we landed in Posen on stiff legs and with a sore back, we were quite happy to have been deprived of this time for introspection. We were met by a group from the 104th Reserve Infantry Battalion. We were ordered to keep pace and led to the garrison. The barracks for the enlisted men certainly did not shine with luxury. The barracks room was not large enough, and besides me there were 40 other men there. There was no time to think about the high duty of the defender of the fatherland. The struggle with the old-timers for survival began. They looked at us as annoying outsiders. My situation was almost hopeless, a youth with no hair. Since only thick stubble was a clear sign of real manhood, I had to keep on the defensive from the start. The envy of the others at the fact that I was only shaving once a week only made it worse. Our training was well suited to getting on my nerves. I often thought of my Ludwig Maximilian University when the mush and drill reached a critical point, or when we were floundering in the mud on the training ground during a field exercise. What such training was for, I learned later. I had to repeatedly use the skills I had acquired in Posen to get out of dangerous situations. However, only a few hours would pass and all the suffering would be forgotten. The hatred we had felt towards the service, towards our superiors, towards our own stupidity during the training was soon gone. Most importantly, we were all convinced that everything we did had a purpose. Any nation can consider itself fortunate to have a young generation that gives its country its best, and fights as selflessly as the Germans did in both wars. No one has the right to reproach us already after the war, even though we abused the ideals with which we were overflowing. Let us hope that the present generation will be spared the disappointment that we were destined to experience. Better yet, let there come a time when no country would need any soldiers because eternal peace would reign. My dream in Posen was to complete my initial infantryman training and still be fragrant as a rose. This dream turned out to be a disappointment mainly because of the foot marches. They started at 15 kilometres, increasing by 5 kilometres each week, reaching 50. It was an unwritten rule that all recruits with superior training should be given to carry a machine gun. Apparently they wanted to test me, the smallest in the unit, and see what the limit of my willpower was and whether I could successfully withstand the challenge. Not surprisingly, when I returned to the garrison one day, I had a sprain and a festering blister the size of a small egg. I was in no condition to further display my valour as an infantryman at Posen. But soon we were transferred to Darmstadt. The proximity to home suddenly made life in the barracks less stressful, and the prospect of being discharged at the end of the week brightened it further. brightened. I think I acted rather cocky when one day the company commander began selecting 12 volunteers for the tank corps. They were supposed to take only auto mechanics, but with a friendly smile I was allowed to join the dozen volunteers. The old man was probably glad to be rid of the underweight. However, I didn't quite consciously make the decision. My father allowed me to join any branch of the army, even aviation, but strictly forbade tank troops. In his mind, he probably already saw me burning in a tank and suffering terrible agony. And, despite all this, I put on the black uniform of a tanker. However, I never regretted this step, and if I had to become a soldier again, the tank corps would be my only choice, about which I had not the slightest doubt. I became a recruit again when I went to the 7th Tank Battalion at Feingen. My tank commander was non-commissioned officer Auguste Dallaire, a huge man and a good soldier. I was the loader. We were all overwhelmed with pride when we received our Czechoslovak 38T tank. We felt almost invincible with the 37mm gun and 2 Czechoslovakian-made machine guns. We admired the armour, not yet realising that it was only a moral defence for us. If necessary, it could only shield us from small arms bullets. We learned the basics of tank combat on the range in Putlos, in Holstein, where we went to the real firing. In October 1940, the 21st Tank Regiment was formed in Feingen. Shortly before the start of the Russian campaign, it joined the 20th Armoured Division during exercises at the Ordurf Range. Our training consisted of joint exercises with infantry units. When in June 1941 we were issued a basic allowance in the form of an inviolable reserve, we realised something must happen. There were various speculations about where we were going to be moved to until we moved in the direction of East Prussia. Although the East Prussian peasants whispered one thing or another to us, we still believed that we were sent to the border to maintain security. This belief was an illusion formed during our training at Putlos, where we trained on tanks moving underwater, so inclined to think that our enemy would be England. Now we were in East Prussia and no longer tormented by uncertainty. We advanced to the border on June 21st. Having received a directive on the situation, we finally learned what our role was. Everyone portrayed an icy calm, although inwardly we were all extremely excited. The tension was becoming unbearable. Our hearts were ready to burst out of our chests when we heard the squadrons of Stuka bombers and dive bombers buzzing over our division to the east. We were positioned at the edge of the forest, south of Calvaria. Our commander had installed an ordinary radio receiver on his tank. Over it we heard the official announcement of the beginning of the Russian campaign 5 minutes before the time C. Except for a few officers and non-commissioned officers, none of us had yet been in combat. So far we had only heard real gunshots at the firing range. We believed in the old soldiers who had iron crosses and combat insignia, and they remained completely unperturbed. Everyone else's stomachs and bladders were failing. We were expecting the Russians to open fire any minute now. But everything remained calm, and to our relief we received orders to attack. We broke through the border posts southwest of Calvaria. When, after a 120-kilometre march by road, we reached Olita by evening, we already felt like veterans. And still we experienced joy when we finally stopped, for our senses had been heightened to the utmost during the march. We kept our weapons at the ready. Everyone was at his post. As I was the loader, I had the most disadvantageous position. Not only could I not see anything, but I could not even stick my nose out into the fresh air. The heat in our car became almost unbearable. Every barn we approached gave us some excitement, but they were all empty. With unusual curiosity, I waited to hear what the commander of our tank would say about what he had seen. We were excited by his report about the first dead Russian he saw. With excitement, we expected the first combat contact with the Russians. But nothing of the sort happened. Since our battalion was not the lead battalion, we could only anticipate such contact if the vanguard was stopped. We reached without incident the first objective of our movement that day, the airfield at Olita. Happy, we threw off our dusty uniforms and were glad when we finally found water to wash ourselves properly. "It's not bad to fight here at all," said our tank commander, non-commissioned officer Delaire, with a chuckle, after he had once again pulled his head out of the tub of water. There seemed to be no end to this washing. The year before he had been in France. The thought of it gave me confidence, for this was my first time in combat, excited but also with some fear. We literally had to dig our weapons out of the mud. In the event of a real fight, we wouldn't be able to fire them. We cleaned everything to a shine and anticipated dinner. "Those pilots did a good job here," said our radio operator, who was cleaning his weapon. He looked toward the edge of the forest where Russian planes were caught on the ground during the first Luftwaffe raids. We stripped off our uniforms and felt as if we had been reborn. Involuntarily, I was reminded of pictures from cigarette packs that we had passionately collected over the years, and one in particular, bivouac in enemy territory. Suddenly, there was a rumbling sound over our heads. "Damn it!" cursed our commander. He was lying next to me in the mud. But it was not the enemy fire that angered him, but my clumsiness. I was lying on breadcrumbs from his army rations. It was some unromantic baptism of fire. The Russians were still in the forest thicket surrounding the airfield. They gathered their scattered units after the initial shock of the day and opened fire on us. Before we realized what was happening, we were already back in our tanks. And then we went into our first night battle, as if we had been doing it year after year. I was surprised at the calmness that took over all of us as soon as we realized the seriousness of what we were doing. We felt almost like seasoned soldiers when the next day we came to help in the tank battle at Olita. We gave support at the crossing of the Niemen River. We were somehow pleased to realize that our tanks were not the same as the Russians, despite our own small losses. The offensive continued without interference. After mastering the Pilsudski Road, it continued in the direction of Vilna, Vilnius, Per. After the capture of Vilna on June 24th, we felt pride and perhaps some self-confidence. We considered ourselves participants of significant events. We almost did not notice how exhausted we were by the strenuous march. But only when we stopped, we immediately fell asleep and fell asleep like dead men. We didn't think much about what was happening. Could we have stopped the advance? Few, perhaps, paid attention to the fact that we were moving along the same road that the great French Emperor Napoleon had once travelled. On the same day and hour 129 years ago, he had given the exact same order to attack to other soldiers accustomed to victory. Was this strange coincidence, coincidental? Or did Hitler want to prove that he would not make the same mistakes as the great Corsican? In any case, we soldiers believed in their abilities and in luck, and it was a good thing we couldn't see into the future. Instead, we had only the will to rush forward and finish the war as soon as possible. We were enthusiastically welcomed everywhere by the Lithuanian population. They saw us as liberators. We were shocked to see that before our arrival, Jewish shops had been destroyed and vandalized everywhere. We thought that this was only possible during Kristallnacht in Germany. It angered us, and we condemned the fury of the mob. But we had no time to ponder this for long. The offensive continued uninterruptedly. Until the beginning of July, we were engaged in reconnaissance and were advancing rapidly to the river Duna, Divina, Daugava. We had an order to move forward, and only forward, day and night, day and night. The drivers were required to do the impossible. Soon I was already sitting in the driver's seat to give a couple hours of rest to our exhausted comrade. If only there wasn't this unbearable dust. We wrapped cloth around our nose and mouth so that we could breathe in the clouds of dust that hung over the road. We had long ago removed the sight gauges from our armour so that we could at least see something. The dust, fine as flour, penetrated everywhere. Our sweat-soaked clothes stuck to our bodies, and a thick layer of dust covered us from head to toe. If we had enough water to drink, the situation would have been more or less bearable, but drinking was forbidden because the wells could be poisoned. We jumped out of cars at stops and looked for puddles. After peeling off the green layer from the surface of the puddle, we wet our lips with water. That way we could hold out a little longer. Our offensive was going in the direction of Minsk. We started fighting north of the city. There was the first major encirclement, the Berezina was forced, and the offensive continued towards Vitebsk. The pace of movement did not slow down. Now there were already problems with maintaining uninterrupted supply. Infantry units could not keep up, no matter how hard they tried. Nobody cared about the areas on both sides of the highway, and there were guerrillas hiding there that we would learn about later. Our field kitchens soon fell hopelessly behind as well. Army bread became a rare delicacy, and although there was an abundance of poultry meat, the monotonous menu soon became tiresome. We began to drool at the thought of bread and potatoes, but the advancing soldiers who hear the fanfare of victory messages on the radio do not take anything too seriously. On July 8th, we were hit. It was the first time I had to get out of a hit car. It happened near the completely burned village of Ula. Our engineering units had built a pontoon bridge next to the blown-up bridge over the Dvina. It was there that we cut into positions along the Dvina. They disabled our vehicle just at the edge of the woods on the other side of the river. It happened in the blink of an eye. A blow to our tank, a metallic scrape, a piercing scream from a comrade. And that was it. A large chunk of armour wedged in next to the radio operator's seat. We didn't need anyone's orders to get out. It was only when I jumped out, grabbing my face with my hand, in a roadside ditch that I found out that I had been hit too. Our radio operator had lost his left arm. We cursed the brittle and inflexible Czech steel that was no obstacle to the Russian 45mm anti-tank gun. The debris from our own armour plates and mounting bolts did more damage than the shrapnel and the shell itself. My knocked-out teeth soon ended up in the nurse's station's trash can. The splinters that stuck in my face stayed there until the first rays of the next day's sun and came out by themselves, as predicted. I was hitchhiking back to the front. Burning villages pointed the way. I met my company just before Vitebsk. The burning city coloured the night sky blood red. After we took Vitebsk the next day, we had the feeling that the war was just beginning. Offensive, defence, suppression of resistance, and pursuit succeeded each other. The events of the 3 weeks were noted in my diary with only a few lines. From 7:11 to 7:16, offensive through Demidov, Dukovshchina, in the direction of Yartsev, Highway Smolensk, Moscow, in order to encircle the enemy forces in the area of Vitebsk, Smolensk, fighting for the crossing of the Dnieper at Gatchina, from 7:17 to 7:24, defensive battle for Yartsevo and at the Vip River. Defensive battle at the Vip, Votria Line, a battle to destroy the encircled enemy forces in the Smolensk Sak, from 7:25 to 7:26, pursuit along the Upa-Dvina River, from 7:27 to 8:4, defensive battle at Yelny and Smolensk. Defensive battle at the River Vip before the Point Bellevue. Behind this enumeration of bare facts are hidden hardships that can be understood only by those who were there. Those who were not there, their enumeration only suggests exaggeration. Therefore, I suppose I can afford not to give further comments, especially since all impressions I can convey only from the point of view of the loader. And the loader is in a position that does not allow him to get a general idea of the operations in progress. Each of us had proven ourselves and tasted the hardships to the full. We were convinced that success was only possible when everyone gave their best. Despite this, we sometimes cursed our commanders, some of whom neglected their duties and showed irresponsibility. After one sweltering day spent in battle, with our parched throats waiting in vain for waiter, we cursed our Hitsov when we learned that our battalion commander had ordered him to bath using water prepared for our coffee. This egregious behaviour by the commander was beyond our comprehension. But the thought of our commander washing himself gave us such a ground for crude soldier jokes that soon the incident was regarded only as a curiosity, the first T-34. Another event hit us like a ton of bricks. For the first time there were Russian tanks, T-34. The amazement was complete. How could it be that up there, did not know about the existence of this excellent tank? T-34, with its good armour, perfect shape, and magnificent 76.2 metres long-barrelled gun, all brought everyone into awe, and it was feared by all German tanks until the end of the war. What were we to do with these monsters thrown against us in multitudes? At that time, the 37-metre gun was still our strongest anti-tank weapon. If we were lucky, we could hit the T-34 turret's shoulder strake and jam it. If even more lucky, the tank would not be able to be effective in combat after that. Certainly not a very encouraging situation. The only way out was left by the 88mm anti-aircraft gun. With its help, it was possible to act effectively even against this new Russian tank. Therefore, we began to treat the anti-aircraft gunners with the highest respect, who had previously received only condescending smiles from us. The Ivans, as if guessing our predicament, for the first time launched an attack in our sector with their "Hurrah! Hurrah!" At first we thought that our infantry was attacking with shouts of "Hurrah!" on its own. However, we soon learned that it was quite the opposite. Since Moscow was thought to be almost in our hands, we had a suspicion that we could no longer count on a speedy end to this campaign. So I had mixed feelings when, on August 4th, 1941, I received the order to leave for Erlangen, to the 25th Tank Reserve Battalion. 3 days before, the non-commissioned officers Gallun had appeared on the epaulettes of my uniform. In Erlangen we passed the exam for the license to drive a truck and a tank. Immediately afterward we arrived in Wunstorf near Berlin to take the officer candidate course. On February 2nd, 1942, I was informed that I did not meet the requirements of this training course. Just like Turt Meyer and Klaus Waldenmeyer from our platoon, I of course did not take all this seriously. Besides, there was one question I was in no way allowed to ask. I thought I had a chance to confide my doubts to the blackboard. But my superiors didn't find it amusing at all to ask, "Are reserve officers human?" So we were still non-commissioned officers and officer candidates when we parted ways with the course. As a matter of fact, we were not too upset about it. After all, the newly minted lieutenants had to serve in reserve units, while we were immediately sent to our former regiment. We were released with words of encouragement. Our officer in charge, whom we all idolized because he was a real personality and treated his duties with all his soul, said in parting that he was sure we would soon reach our goal at the front. There we will be able to prove much more easily that we are worthy to become officers. Even today I remember him. In my mind, I congratulated the Bundeswehr on its good fortune when I learned that Oberst Philipp had become commander of the training regiment in Andernach. Back in the same old company again, we found the 21st Regiment in winter positions in Gzhatsk. It had thinned terribly. Only one company was still manned with tanks. All other vehicles had been put out of action in the battles during the disgraceful withdrawal in the winter of 1941-42. "We were waiting for you," our comrades welcomed me. "Well, show us what they taught you." They smirked conspiratorially, and we felt that something was being planned. We were given a task to change the snow-clearing outfit. It consisted of clearing the road on the platform in front of the tanks during combat operations so that they would not get stuck. In the snow, in your black uniform, in front of the tanks, what a job. Contrary to expectations, everything went smoothly. Besides, of course, we were in a better position than our comrades, who had to act like infantrymen in their tank uniforms. With envy, we looked at how well equipped the Ivans were compared to us. We experienced real happiness when several resupply tanks finally arrived at us from deep behind the lines. The 10th Company was completely re-equipped, and I was able to take my platoon. From March to the end of June 1942, we were stuck in defensive battles with the Russians around the positions we had occupied since the winter near Gzhatsk and east of Vyazma. We were then transferred to the Sikevka area, where we took part in defensive fighting east of Belaya. During this battle I was promoted, and a few days later something happened that almost made me lose my new epaulettes. My platoon positioned itself along a forest trail. Beautiful place, my driver rightly remarked. We couldn't be seen from the front or the back, trees and bushes everywhere. No man's land began on the other side of the trail. Next to us, somewhat off to the side, was an anti-tank gun. Along with us were infantrymen. We were in our shelters far behind the front line. One morning I was called by an excited commander. "Hey, Carius, look at this, just like in the movies. Imagine that. Just equipped field division of the Luftwaffe passed our location on the way to the front. It took my breath away, like in a fairy tale. From duffel bags to guns, everything was brand new. We saw weapons we only knew about from rumours, MG-42 machine guns, a 75mm anti-tank long-barreled gun, and other amazing things. We wanted to believe that we would finally be able to completely re-equip our units as well. Everything that was going to the front guaranteed a quiet winter in this sector. Our company commander was naturally eager to get a closer look at all this splendour, and we moved to the front line to reconnoitre the situation. An atmosphere of confident calm prevailed. It seemed as if we were in the neighbourhood of an exercise. The non-commissioned officers wore elegant visor caps. The soldiers moved lazily and bored into their positions. There was absolutely no sign of battle. For this reason, they had shrouded their MG-42 machine guns to prevent any dirt from getting into them. It was simply impossible to persuade their comrades in arms to demonstrate this hitherto unknown miracle to us at least once. And what will happen if the Ivans decide to attack here? Before the weapons would be ready for battle, the Russians would seize the positions. Our fears were soon confirmed. A deafening rumble coming from the northeast woke us up one morning. We strained our hearing for a few minutes, after which nothing could keep us in our underground shelters. Outside, a blizzard of prickly snow was taking our breath away and knocking us off our feet. For the Russians, it was perfect weather for an attack. Without waiting for the alarm to sound, we woke the company. Our suspicions were confirmed. Soon a report came in that the Russians had broken through. We found the commander of the Luftwaffe Field Division at the command post in a state of utter despair. He did not know where his units were. The Russian tanks had crushed everything around them before the anti-tank guns could fire a single shot. The Ivans captured the latest equipment, and the divisions scattered in all directions. Fortunately, the enemy, after a quick initial victory, immediately stopped. He was afraid of being ambushed. With some effort, our regiment was able to eliminate the breakthrough. It was a real madhouse. When one infantry unit approached the village, they were saluted by men in Luftwaffe uniforms. Suddenly they opened annihilating fire. They were Russians, in trophy winter clothes. We were afterward ordered to shoot at any military man in a Luftwaffe uniform, as it could only be Russians in disguise. Unfortunately, several of our scattered assault groups fell victim to this order. As soon as, over the next few days and weeks, we heard M42 machine gun fire in the distance, we could have sworn on our lives that it was the Russians firing. We never got to try any of them in action, and our infantrymen usually had to make do with the Russians' trophy weapons. We were all furious at the thought of the failure of those who had entrusted the best weapons to completely inexperienced, poorly trained troops and thrown them straight to the front. How carefully we handled men and equipment in the following weeks in the offensive and defensive battles south of the Belev-Kozelsk-Sukinichi line. I experienced a particularly unpleasant moment in one of the operations as a newly minted lieutenant and commander of the demining platoon. We were assigned to demine the terrain before the tanks went through it. I was surprised that I got only a superficial wound in my arm. After that, I began to appreciate the work of our sappers. I was happy when I was transferred back to the old 1st Company. I saw August Deller, my old tank commander, again. He had by then become a field flaybill, and naturally we rode together in the same platoon. In the operation in which we took part, our battalion suffered its heaviest losses since the beginning of the campaign. The Russians made extensive use of anti-tank guns, which easily penetrated the armour of our tanks. Our losses were very heavy. Many of our comrades were mortally wounded in their tanks, and the seriously wounded had to be evacuated. We were completely helpless in the night battle. The Russians let us get too close. By the time we spotted them, it was too late to defend ourselves, as it was impossible to use tank sights at night. A feeling of defenselessness overwhelmed us. Fortunately, the first TIY tanks with a 75mm long-barreled gun, TIY tanks with thicker armour and a 50mm long-barreled gun, began to arrive in small numbers from deep behind the lines. It was a glimmer of hope for the possibility of gaining new strength that had appeared so often during the war in Russia. After the actual loss of hope and all faith in our own machines, we were cheered up again, and this enthusiasm was enough for the last unsuccessful attack on Plavsk and Belev. In the meantime, January 1943 had come. I was supposed to take a leave of absence to the rear until the forthcoming abolition of vacations. The evening before my departure, Auguste Dallaire brought his tank out of its hiding place. It was dug into the ground to thus escape the searing cold. Dallaire trotted across the smooth plain in his fur boots and slid to the front of the machine's left track. It caught him and the driver didn't notice it. The rest of the crew screamed and the tank was immediately stopped, but the caterpillar had already hit Dallaire's upper thigh. He died on the spot without making a sound. I lost one of my best friends. Then I was truly ready for vacation by now and was looking forward to coming home to my parents' house. But things were looking up that I wouldn't have to enjoy my stay there. Soon a telegram arrived announcing my transfer to the 500th Training Battalion. Disappointed, I wondered why I couldn't go back to my old company. I had arrived at Putlos expecting to have to take another artillery training course. I would have been more than happy to go back to my old front company. That's what I thought until, on arrival at headquarters, I learned that officers with frontline experience and a few companies from the Eastern Front were to be trained here on a new type of tank, the Tiger. The news spread like wildfire, but no one knew anything concrete about it yet. We had a chance to see some prototypes of this tank in the finalization stage, but we did not like them very much. Hauptmann Lüttichau was to lead the training. I knew him from Russia and did not consider it very kind of him to decide to make me in charge of the officers' meeting. Probably there were no other junior officers available. Nevertheless, there was nothing I could do. Nothing at the time suggested that the job would bring me luck. We went to Paderborn, the location of the 500th Training Battalion, which was later given responsibility for all units with Tigers. I met with Captain Schober, the head of the officers' meeting. He had come from Russia with his company for retraining. Von Lüttichau strictly ordered me to fulfill all of Schober's wishes regarding the provision of alcoholic beverages. They were close friends. Schober liked to have a drink or two from time to time. He made almost daily appearances at my establishment, as I had to control the scarce supply. There we got to know each other better, and became respectful of each other. I had a feeling that he liked me not only because of his special fondness for French vermouth. We also often spent time in the company of guys from his company. I was particularly happy when he once asked me, "Carius, would you like to join my company?" "Yes, I'm ready right away, Herr Hauptmann." I couldn't believe my luck. Initially, only 2 companies were formed. At most, only 6 men were needed from the entire group of officers. And I was one of them. On my recommendation, Schober took Oberleutnant von Schiller as his deputy. I knew him from the 21st Regiment. I was relieved of my position in the officers' assembly shortly after my transfer to the new company. Schober had been drinking heavily. It should also be considered that he had been supplying the whole company with liquor all this time. When they demanded several bottles for a reception in honour of some big shot, I had to respectfully report that there was not a single drop left. Well, my successor didn't have to take any supplies. The transfer was not onerous. I could devote myself entirely to the affairs of the company. When Schober introduced me to the company, I couldn't help but think of the comments of my travelling companions when I was called up. I will never forget the stares of Company Field Officer Rieger and Senior Field Officer Delzeit. They later confessed their first impression of me. It could be summarized by the following statement: "What a runt! Where did our old man dig up this little fart?" Naturally, it was difficult for an outsider to gain confidence in a fighting company. But everything went smoothly. Even before our departure for France, where we were to receive our Tigers, I became very friendly with these guys. It seemed as if I had always been with them. Unfortunately, Hauptmann Schober was called up to take command over the battalion. His farewell speech echoed in my ears for a long time and encouraged me. He asked the soldiers to show the same trust in me that they had shown in him. I put my heart and soul into my duties. After several months of training, we made great progress, outperforming the other companies in the battalion. During the training, we had fewer technical failures than others. I did not dare to hope for that when Schober handed the company over to Hauptmann Radke. Hauptmann Ume commanded the 3rd Company. The 1st Company had been gaining experience as an experimental unit in the northern sector of the Eastern Front since the fall of 1942. Once formed and manned, we were to follow it to the Leningrad area. In Brittany first, however, we travelled west to Pleurmel in Brittany. The company was assigned to an abandoned chateau. The company commander and deputy were given separate accommodation in the town. I opted to be housed with the company. We needed to get to know each other if we were going to go into battle together. None of my actions went unnoticed. I eagerly, and as a matter of course, took for granted all the inconveniences I had to deal with in the small, musty room of our castle. The fun began as soon as we moved in. We had to clean up the old stables before we could even think about living there. There were no wooden floors or wooden planks. At first, I wanted to get at least some straw for my men. But the neighbouring farm refused to give me anything without a written order from the local administration. So I went to the town hall, but it was already closed. I quickly filled out a document for the farmer so that he could file a complaint on the basis of it. Just as quickly I received a reprimand from the battalion commander. If we hadn't left for the Eastern Front soon after that, I would probably have been dragged through the authorities, a case of theft or something like that. After the war, I often had to think about this when I saw how easily the French occupation troops provided themselves with everything they needed at our expense. During this period, I had to take the war crime of summary massacre on my conscience. I was next in line during live firing on the outskirts of the township when a rooster from a neighbouring farm ran right across the range. It was likely that an order had been given to keep farm animals in pens during the firing range. I had just taken aim when the rooster came between me and the target. The commander yelled something, but it was too late. The rooster did a few somersaults and then turned into something hardly edible. The company commander was sternly reprimanding me when the rooster's distraught owner came running in, having to say goodbye to her pet. Even money could not calm her down, because the killed rooster was clearly the best rooster in the area. An integral part of our stay in France, of course, was red wine. The Austrians in the company were particularly fond of it. There wasn't an evening when I didn't have to jump out of bed and put to bed the Austrians who had been drinking. The barracks duty officer was usually unable to turn off the lights, as more than half the company was made up of non-commissioned officers, who served as drivers, gunners, and tank commanders. I almost always had to call off the lights myself. But usually this did not happen until I had drained the glass of wine offered to me and listened to a Viennese song. We didn't take the obligatory mush and formation too seriously, just mimed movement when the superiors showed up, so as not to stand out too much. I was happy to be able to enjoy a few carefree days before being sent to the front. Soon teams were formed to transport from Germany and transfer the Tigers. One of these teams was entrusted to me, so I had to linger in Paris. The city and its people interested me very much, although it was difficult to keep up a conversation with them. I admired the way the French behaved. God knows they had lost the war, but not a word was said in reproach to their soldiers. They also refrained from criticizing us in any way. To blacken one's own name seems to be characteristic only of the Germans. Our troops in Paris behaved as if the war was already over and won. This behaviour amazed me. I never forgot that in a few weeks we would be locked in it again with the Russians. Naturally, during the return trip, our thoughts were occupied with the new tank. How would the Tiger behave? Outwardly, it looked handsome and pleasing to the eye. It was thick. Almost all the flat surfaces are horizontal, and only the front gable is welded almost vertically. The thicker armour made up for the lack of rounded shapes. Ironically, just before the war, we supplied the Russians with a huge hydraulic press with which they were able to produce their T-34s with such elegantly rounded surfaces. Our armament specialists did not consider them valuable. In their opinion, such thick armour could never be needed. As a result, we had to put up with flat surfaces. Even if our Tiger wasn't a beauty, its margin of safety encouraged us. It really did drive like a car. With literally 2 fingers, we could drive the 60-ton behemoth with 700 horsepower, going 45 kilometers per hour on the road and 20 kilometers per hour on rough terrain. However, taking into account the additional equipment, we could only go at a speed of 20–25 kilometers per hour on the road, and respectively at an even lower speed on off-road. Apparently, the greatest responsibility for the readiness of the machine fell on the mechanic driver. He must drive the vehicle by working with his head, not his hindquarters. If he acts decisively, his Tiger will never let him down in a difficult moment. Only a really good tank driver can be allowed to Tiger, and in addition, he must subtly feel the nature of the terrain. He will have to move properly over rough terrain. He must always keep the tank facing the enemy, less vulnerable side, not relying on the tank commander to prompt every maneuver. Only then will the tank commander be able to concentrate entirely on the enemy, and the platoon or company commander will be in the course of the battle to direct the vehicle where it needs to go, without constantly being distracted by the nature of the terrain. Willpower is also required of the tank driver. After all, he is the only crew member who can see a great deal, but who has to remain passive when the tank is under fire and the rest of the crew is engaged with the enemy. In such cases, he helps by observation and must rely entirely on his comrades in the turret. Taking into account the above-mentioned qualities of the mechanized driver, it becomes clear why tank commanders are usually tank commanders rather than gunners. Take, for example, 2 commanders, Kirscher and Link. Both were originally mechanized drivers. Also, my old faithful Karl Berisch immediately took my place as tank commander after I was wounded in 1944. May the reader allow me to convey some interesting information to show how much of our work is not finished at the end of a combat operation. For all of us, especially the driver, it is truly still just beginning because we have to be in uniform the next day. The fuel tanks hold 530 litres. That is 27 20-litre jerry cans. With this amount, we could go exactly 80 kilometres over rough terrain. Battery maintenance was important, especially in winter. They had to be constantly recharged by starting the engine, if we had not travelled too much before. Otherwise, the starter could no longer start the engine. If that happened, 2 crew members would get out and start the engine with an inertia starter like the one used on old airplanes, but only located in the back. It doesn't take too much imagination to realise that there is no more extreme situation than this, in the midst of battle and in full view of the enemy. In spite of our efforts, it sometimes happened that the batteries found themselves strung out. At the front, we soon came up with an ingenious way of avoiding getting out. We called a neighbouring tank. He turned his gun back, slowly crawled up behind the front tank, nudged the stuck tank, and its engine usually started after a few metres of forward movement. The radio equipment, interior and exterior lighting, fan, and electric gun lowering depended on the batteries, so it is understandable how important their condition was. A 120-litre Waiter radiator and 4 fans provided engine cooling. The cooling system louvers at the stern, absolutely necessary for the removal of heated air, often caused the tank to become inoperable after being hit by shells or shrapnel that would not otherwise have harmed it. They damaged the radiators located at the bottom. The engine required 28 litres of oil, the gearbox 30 litres, the reduction gear 12 litres, the turret system 5 litres, and the fan motors 7 litres. A pair of large air cleaners capture dust. When you consider that a march of only 7 kilometres forces 170,000 litres of air into the machine, while dust is lifted from the surface of nearly 4 acres of land, and that's the amount of dust inhaled by the person sitting aft in the dustiest place. It's clear that cleaning the air filters is necessary before each march. With a regularly cleaned filter, an operation can go 5,000 kilometres without changing the engine. With dirty filters, we could not cover even 500 kilometres. 4 carburetors provided the fuel supply to the engine, and the whole process was managed by the driver-mechanic. The capriciousness of carburetors was the biggest disadvantage of German gasoline engines, which lost to the unpretentious diesel engines of the Russians. However, the ability to recover more quickly was an advantage of the German tank engine. The semi-automatic gearbox had 8 forward and 4 reverse gears. These allowed the traction force to be shifted from one track to the other when turning. When turning in place, one track moved forward and the other track moved backward. The box was equipped with an automatic hydraulic servo drive. To change gears, it was not necessary to squeeze the pedal of the main friction. The mechanic driver of the Tiger sat at the control levers and could control the 63-ton machine as easily as a car. In other tanks, it was necessary to exert a lot of effort to steer. The overlapping suspension had 8 axles on each side. On each axle were 3 balancers, which rotated inside the track and supported it at the same time. Lighter types of German tanks had both balancers and support rollers. To think how many of these rollers have to be removed from a Tiger, in case only one inner roller needs to be replaced. The 22-litre engine worked best at 2600 RPM. At 3000 RPM, it quickly overheated. Before loading the tank on the platform, the off-road track had to be replaced with a narrower one. Otherwise, it protruded out the sides of the platform and posed a danger to oncoming traffic. Special 6-axle platforms were designed for transportation by rail. They could carry 80 tons and went with each battalion to the combat area. At least 4 other freight cars had to be placed between the 2 platforms with the Tigers in order not to put a dangerous load on the railroad bridges. The turret was rotated by means of a hydraulic transmission. The gunner's feet rested on an inclined pedal. If he pressed with his toe forward, the turret rotated to the right. If he pressed with his heel backward, it rotated to the left. The harder he pressed in one direction or the other, the faster the movement. At the slowest movement, it took 60 minutes to turn the turret gun 360 degrees. At its fastest, 60 seconds. This ensured extreme accuracy of aiming. An experienced gunner did not need to adjust the gun manually. If the gun had an electric trigger, a light finger pressure was enough to fire the gun. This avoided the inevitable jerk when firing. Our most dangerous opponents in Russia were the T-34 and T-34-85 tanks, which were equipped with long-barreled 76.2 and 85mm guns. These tanks posed a danger to us already at a distance of 600 metres from the front, 1,500 metres from the sides and 1,800 metres from the rear. If we hit such a tank, we could destroy it from 900 metres with our 88mm cannon. The tank Joseph Stalin, which we met in 1944, was at least equal to the Tiger. It won significantly in terms of form, as well as the T-34. I will not go into details regarding KV-1, KV-85, and other not-so-often encountered types of enemy tanks, as well as self-propelled guns of larger calibre. The tank company fully equipped with Tigers had 14 combat vehicles. Their combat power thus exceeded that of an entire anti-aircraft battalion, 3 batteries of 4 guns each. The cost of producing one Tiger was up to 1 million Reichsmarks. For this reason, only a few battalions of heavy tanks were formed. Becoming a commander of such a company meant taking on great responsibility. After we more or less got acquainted with our Tigers, when we were sent to the east. The small town of Ploermel was celebrating the Feast of Corpus Christi. The town officials had been notified of the time we were to be loaded onto the wagons so that the celebrations of the faithful would be over by the time we and our tanks left for the railroad station. But what did these people care? That the German front near Leningrad was demanding reinforcements, and that the troops there were waiting impatiently for us. Grumbling endlessly, We had to wait almost 3 hours before we could begin loading. Our Tigers were carefully shielded from prying ease. They were covered with tarpaulins so that not a single bolt could be seen. Despite this, we had the feeling that the enemy already knew as much about the new tanks as we did. The train, as we soon noticed, was indeed a fast train. We only made a brief stop to change the locomotive. From Metz, I sent a telegram home, although I doubted that any of my relatives would manage to get from Zweibrücken to Homburg in Saarland in such a short time. But a real soldier's mother can do anything. As soon as our train approached, she was already waiting on the platform. Besides, I was doubly lucky, because there was just a locomotive change taking place. So I had the opportunity to introduce my mother to the guys I was going to the front with. Fortunately, we had no idea what was going to happen to us as we travelled through Germany all the way to Leningrad. We had new cars, and we drove toward new events with more calmness than we had set out on any previous operation. From time to time, we looked at the monsters hidden under the tarpaulin with a kind of feeling akin to love. At least we could accomplish something with their help. The Tiger was the heavyweight among our combat vehicles. The lightest tank of the series was the T1, the Krupp sports car, as it was nicknamed in the troops. Its crew consisted of 2 men, its weight barely reached 6 tons, and its armament consisted of 2 machine guns. By the time of the Russian campaign, we had already left it at home. 3 men made up the crew of the T2. It was somewhat heavier than the TI, and also had a 20mm rapid-fire cannon. By that time, it was used only for reconnaissance purposes in platoons of light tanks. The crew of the T3 consisted of 5 men. It weighed exactly 20 tons and was armed with a 50mm short-barreled gun, later long-barreled, and 2 machine guns. The Czech tank 38T was approximately the same as the TG tank. But in addition to the fact that the Czech tank had a worse quality steel, it lost also in the fact that its crew consisted of only 4 people. The tank commander had to both observe and shoot at the same time. The TIV tank could be found in the heavy tank company of each battalion. It also carried 5 tankers. Its weight ranged from 22 to 28 tons. Up until the end of 1942, this fighting vehicle was equipped with a short-barreled 75mm gun. Later, it had a long-barreled gun of the same caliber. The TV tank was known as the Panther. It was a new development, made with the experience of the war in mind. The tank was operated by 5 men, it weighed 42 tons, and was armed with a 75mm ultra-long-barreled gun, 2 machine guns, and it had a turret-turning mechanism like the Tiger. There were 5 of us, and in our Tiger, the 88mm cannon, 2 machine guns, semi-automatic transmission and 700 horsepower engine completed the impressive appearance of the 60-ton machine. The 88mm gun was the same as the one that had proved itself brilliantly in anti-aircraft units. It was also used as a basis, but with an even longer barrel in the new anti-tank guns. Soon we were to put the tank to a severe test. Our final destination was located near Gacina. There we experienced our first failure. There was no inclined ramp, and one of the Tigers toppled over, falling on its side. An encouraging start. Reports at the end of 1st Company's combat operations were also not too encouraging. Our comrades had been hustling in the area near Leningrad since September 4th, 1942. In the first 4 weeks, they had to participate in the first defensive battles south of Lake Ladoga. Then they got bogged down in position battles around Leningrad in the Yinzas Army Corps strip. From January 12 to May 5, 1943, they took part in the second defensive battle south of Lake Ladoga in the Pogostinsky Sack and south of Kolpin. In the course of these operations, casualties were inevitable. It also became quite clear that in the swampy terrain tanks would have to be left to their crews from time to time. While orders were given that no Tiger should fall into Russian hands under any circumstances, a tank that had been set on fire often had to be abandoned and the crew had to destroy its weapons. Crashed tanks and tank wrecks gave the Russians sufficient information that we had something new. In the operations that followed, we quickly found an excellent description of the Tiger by the Russians. Every Russian had such a description so that they would know our vulnerable points. Since our own leadership had not issued an instruction manual, we used the Russian publications for our own training. In this way we also familiarized ourselves with the vulnerable points of our own equipment. The debut of our Tiger was supposed to take place on July 22, 1943, with daily use for 8 weeks. This was the third battle for Ladoga. By every means available to them, the Russians were trying for the third time to re-establish overland communication with Leningrad. This would allow the use of the Belomor Canal and the Volkhov-Leningrad Railroad. We loaded onto trains on July 21st. We failed to reach our destination. With great difficulty we reached only Snegyre, a small railroad station near the settlement of Mugar. With great difficulty we unloaded our Tigers from the platforms. The Russian artillery shifted fire as soon as we showed ourselves, and we again had to unload them without a sloping ramp. The third company was thrown into action right off the platform. Hauptmann Ume, the company commander, and Lieutenant Grunewald were killed before we arrived with our echelon. The Ivans rained clouds of fighter planes down on us, something we were not used to. Circling around and mimicking our Stuka dive bombers, they destroyed everything. Separate fragments of dismembered bodies of people and animals, broken equipment were lying on the highway. It was a picture the likes of which I had seen only in 1945, along the roads in the west, along which the retreating troops were passing. As a rule, we were able to move along the road at night. It was almost impossible for units using horse traction to advance. We, too, were soon thrown into this hell. We fiddled with the Russians until the end of September. Neither side could boast of success, all only noted losses. Signavino, height X, the road to Mazurino and the village codenamed Bunker. For all survivors these names revive the memory of the brutal battles. Battles took place here and there from day to day. Important positions often changed hands several times. Once we were fighting with a company against the village of Bunker. I was moving from the southeast. It was expected that as soon as I approached the village, I would be supported by an attack from the woods southwest of where I would be. On reaching the spot, however, I expected a second group of Tigers in vain. I never learned the real reason why the comrades of the other company had left us in a difficult situation. We had to get out of it ourselves, facing the anti-tank positions. We caught a glimpse of a few tanks, but soon we didn't know where was the front and where was the rear. We were very lucky to get out of there before we had time to cause confusion in the Russian ranks. I was overjoyed that all my Tigers were together again. Who would have had time in such confusion to follow orders and make sure that no damaged Tigers were left behind? Someone had carefully supplied each Tiger tank commander with a high explosive charge. It was vertically attached to a holder at the right arm of the tank commander, next to the seat in the turret. It could be used to destroy the gun without any effort. In addition to the hand grenades lying around the tank commander, this was another innovation. I would have willingly done without them. In case the tank would receive a fatal blow, its commander had a complete guarantee that it would not fall into the hands of the Russians, and if it did, it would be in such a state that it would be unrecognizable. I ended up using the aforementioned holder to hold a bottle of schnapps. It was a better sedative for my crew of 5 than any high-explosive charge. At times, we actually believed that alcohol was the only thing that would get us through the bloody carnage. We were disappointed that the successes we had hoped for by getting new vehicles never came. To top it all off, our battalion changed command almost as often as the heights at Sinyavin changed hands. Many comrades were killed. The platoon leader of our 3rd platoon, then non-commissioned officer Fanstiel, and also non-commissioned officer Kinzel. He was one of my jolly Austrians from the castle at Pluermel, a loyal Viennese in the good old sense of the word. The uselessness of many of the measures taken in close proximity to the front also displeased us. For example, someone came up with the idea of strengthening the roads in the swampy area around Tosno. It was supposed to make wooden decks and cover them with asphalt. The roads had already been laid all the way to Gatchina and then approached the front. The Russians, of course, were eager to take advantage of this and the good roads for the offensive in January 1944. We had to make do with log decks for almost 3 years. The log decks were a separate story. Anyone who had to drive on them can tell you something. Despite the many offshoots, traffic jams on them were inevitable. Driving off the roads was impossible, even far behind the front lines. Low-growing marshy forests began immediately on the left and right sides. On one of the trips through this transportation network, I again showed myself from an unsightly side. I was returning from a meeting, I wanted to get to the front, and, as always, I was in a hurry. Suddenly, someone started honking behind me like a crazy person. I had to pull over to one of the side tracks and let him pass, because he had a clearly more powerful car, and he was in even more of a hurry than I was. But if we pulled off onto one of those branching tracks, we risked almost certainly getting knocked off this network of roads. The traffic was non-stop, and no one would stop to let us get back on it. So I kept driving forward, even when I looked back to make sure there was a car with a staff flag behind me. Eventually, one of the usual jams forced us to stop, and I soon received a weighty nudge. It was a Hauptmann from the headquarters of Lindemann, commander of Army Group North. He immediately gave me a headbutt. When I explained to him that my presence at the front was as important as his inspection, and that he probably would not even be able to travel here if it were not for the soldiers holding the front, he demanded my papers. "You will report to the army commander and find out from him personally what is necessary and what is not," he announced to me in a menacing tone. And the next day I found out what was necessary and what was not. Lindemann received me kindly. In the battles at the Western Wall he met my father. Instead of a scolding, we had a funny conversation. "How lucky this guy is," said my comrades when I returned from this rendezvous with a satisfied smile. After many weeks, the Russians were finally quieted in the sector south of Lake Ladoga. They have fallen silent again. We retreated from the front line and encamped at Chernovo, near Gatchina. Most of the vehicles were ready to be sent to repair shops. We had to eliminate the usual minor malfunctions during the run-in period. The commander of our company was transferred, and command of the company passed to the former deputy, Oberleutnant von Schiller. I remained the only other officer in the company until the following summer. During a break in the fighting, I was assigned the task of scouting the roads on the outskirts of Leningrad, which lead north from Gatchina to the road along the coastline, and the connecting roads between them. While doing this, I had to establish contact with the infantry at the front. In addition to this, all bridges and drainage pipes had to be checked for strength. If necessary, military engineers had to reinforce them so that the span corresponded to the dimensions of the Tiger, and the passage was decorated with the sign of our tactical unit with the image of a mammoth. Unfortunately, the Russians were the only ones who reaped the benefits of our work there when the offensive came in 1944. During these reconnaissance trips, I had the opportunity to familiarize myself with the Leningrad front. A few kilometers down the highway, we could see a crane working in the port. This crane gave us a great deal of trouble because it was a great observation point for the Russians. It could not be brought down by artillery. When I was on the front line approaching the terminus of the Leningrad streetcar, I cast a glance at the city from the broken trolleybuses and asked myself, why didn't we take the city in 1941? At that time, there would hardly have been any serious resistance. We learned from a captured female doctor that the city was practically starving to death in the winter of 1941 to 42. The bodies of the dead were stacked one on top of the other like stacks of firewood. She said that now life in Leningrad is almost back to normal. The population goes to work without interference. Where and when the Germans will open fire is already known in advance. In addition, she said, we had almost no ammunition left. When later we learned from the testimony of another prisoner that there were no soldiers left at all in Leningrad in 1941, and the city was practically abandoned by Russian troops at that time, it became clear even to the very last driver of the soldiers' canteen that this mistake could never be corrected. Although developments on the front had been going in the same direction for nearly 3 years, nothing substantial had been done to contain the Russian offensive that was sure to follow. They, the leaders, promised the division commanders that bulldozers would be sent from the deep rear in the fall of 1943. They were supposed to use them to dig anti-tank ditches in front of particularly dangerous sections of the front line. This was after we had been there for 3 years already. By the time these bulldozers finally arrived, the ground had frozen so badly that there was nothing to think about using them. The Russians, of course, made the best use of them the following spring. With Leningrad as the cornerstone of the Eastern Front, we could winter in well-prepared positions. This would give us an acceptable starting point for a new offensive in the spring of 1942. The attack on Moscow was favoured over the capture of Leningrad. The attack choked in the mud when the capital of Russia opened before us was within easy reach. What then happened in the infamous winter of 1941–42 cannot be conveyed in oral or written reports. The German soldier had to hold out in inhuman conditions against Russian divisions accustomed to winter and extremely well armed. Our regiments, or, it would be better to say, what was left of them, had been holding their positions for months, and it had become a living hell for them. With frostbitten limbs, half-starved and morally depressed, we, incomprehensibly, were still able to spend an entire winter in these originally held positions. Ask those who were on the Eastern Front during that first winter or another winter or two why they had no sympathy for those who had been severely punished or put in camps for sedition or sabotage or other such misdemeanours during the war. These are the very people who were later honoured as heroes and martyrs.